You are watching Channel Africa Conversations.
It's a two-stick approach or two-pronged approach. He's basically blaming the problems on migration and then negotiating with the EU, to receive funds to actually stop the migration in Tunisia and not allow them to go through.
Hello and welcome to this Channel Africa podcast, Channel Africa Conversations. Tunisia's President Kais Saied has won a landslide victory, re-electing him as president for a second term. This after political opponents were jailed, imprisoned and opposing voices silenced. What now for the country's future? We find out on Channel Africa Conversations. Tunisia has seen Kais Saied re-elected in the country's elections in October, getting 90.7% of the vote. But it has come at a cost. Political voices silenced and the country's institutions overhauled to give him more power. Some are even saying that he perhaps may be a worse dictator than former President Ben Ali. So what now for the country's future? To help us unpack this on our podcast, we now talk to Ibrahim Dean, who's a researcher and a political commentator on North African and Middle East affairs. Ibrahim, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ibrahim, I guess it was a foregone conclusion he was going to win the election. He did everything that he needed to.
Yes. Aside from institutionalizing or capturing, if you put it in terms, the judiciary and the judicial, the high authority on elections, Said even went so far as to ensure that trumped up charges meant that one of the candidates standing against him, or the only candidate then who was not, part of his inner circle or did not support him, was actually then arrested and, put in prison for 12 years. The other candidate, Zohair Maghzoui, supported him. So, it was a one-man running, and then when that happens, similarly as in neighboring Algeria, we're looking at turnout. And turnout figures was at 27%. So it does show that, that most don't necessarily support him. But yes, I mean, he is in charge now, and aside from the processes that were flawed, the vote itself was, I mean, there was only one candidate, so he would have won it.
So 27% voter turnout, that is not a real mandate, is it?
No, I mean, and this is Tunisia, a country where just 12 years ago turnout was in the 70s and 80s, percentages, just after uprisings. But what we saw was, as you said, the silencing of dissent, both at arresting politicians, NGO officials, but also media organizations using laws aimed at or focusing on international funding to actually accuse them of sedition and terrorism. Also then capturing the process of candidacy. So there was an election last year which saw 10% turnout for regional elections, and ensuring that any candidate needed to get a certain amount of signatures or certain amount of candidate endorsements from the municipal levels, which had already been captured. And then even when looking at signatures, trying to call for writing signatures, looking at those issues. So the process itself is very, very flawed. And unfortunately, the Tunisia has had a good amount of elections over the past 12 to 13 years, 6 to 7 different electoral votes. And that's meant that many were tired or have become tired of the political process itself. So many don't trust politicians in general. And, so yes, most have then just chose to abstain, and opposition in a sense is at that political NGO media level, while on the ground people are still struggling and just trying to carry on with life.
So give us a little bit of background. When Saeed first came to power, a lot of people thought that this perhaps might be a breath of fresh air, that a new era was dawning, and he seemed very popular. What has happened since?
So, what happened was in the early years, Tunisia had an election in 2011, it had an election in 2013, 2016, and many did not see any real economic change. And then, was the presidential election of 2019, wherein seen as an outsider, constitutional law professor, was elected in the second, I think it's 70% of the vote. Um, Mainly because people were already then became very distrustful of the political, uh, the political process, the elite competition within the country's politics, because there had been no changes, and Said, seen as an outsider, who had his campaign in coffee shops, not with not much backing, gained a lot of support, and things had been not necessarily going very well already then. It does need to be noted that Tunisia was at the time largely a parliamentary system, so parliament controlled, the power rather than the presidency so much. Um, COVID-19 happened, the situation worsened, economic growth. Tunisia's tourism was a big factor in Tunisia, and that, those rents or tourism income had lessened because of COVID-19. Then the conflict in neighboring Libya, and in 2021, when Said then decided to launch a constitutional coup by actually, dismissing the parliament, many supported him initially, and so there was no real opposition. Many said that maybe this outsider would actually rejig politics and actually make it work for the people. However, over the past 2 years, we've seen him further consolidate control. So, consolidate control of these media organizations, what they publish, how they publish things, um, move away parliamentary freedoms, immunization from trial, which is allowing him now to, imprison many former politicians, and also, control appointment of judges, which we've seen. So he's controlling all the different levels of control. And also there was then a rewriting of the constitution and a parliamentary vote, which show as at less than 10% participation. So already then we're seeing, people become disillusioned. Now, whether or not, and the big issue has been economic growth, which is stagnant over the past few years. Inflation is on the high, and unemployment is increasing again to levels before 2011. The difference, though, is two. One is that most politicians are opposed to him from all across the spectrum in Tunisia, the leftists to the centrists, and Nahda, former Ben Ali party officials. Um, but so there is a uniform consensus. But on the ground, people are fearful and struggling. And two is Said's support is largely because of his ability to crack down on migration to Europe. And European funding has actually meant that he's not necessarily needed to accept the IMF loan. And so, that regional politics and global politics, especially in terms of migration, means that, stability is seen as an option as opposed to looking at the clear democracy and clear popular participation.
Are being made between his rule now and perhaps Ben Ali in the last 10 years of his tenure. And these dictatorial tendencies saw the downfall of Ben Ali. How stable do you think the Tunisian administration is now? Is this line that he's taken one that can last?
I think at the moment, when we're looking at the political system, one is, people, as I said, are alienated, disillusioned, and not necessarily coalescing. That that means that it's very likely that he'll endure, especially because he's got international support. The Europeans are not going to move away from supporting him, because the Italian migrant crisis, for example, over the past year has been at an all-time low because of the deal with Tunisia and Niger and Libya. So that's one aspect. Two is, the constitution allows him 2 terms in office. And so I think that, worse the situation to continue and endure post 2029, there may be, more protests. I mean, Said has only been in power now for 5 years. If that get extended, maybe then there will be a lot more, uh, protests around his rule. But for now, many I mean, within the political and elite class, there is opposition to him, but it's at a very domestic level and not enough to actually gain full popular support. So we're seeing protests, but the protest numbers are, they're high, but not high enough to actually see real change, or to force him to use the security apparatus, to actually contain power. So it's a constitutional coup in a sense, which, I mean, obviously, because the situation has worsened, and because there's that distrust of politicians in general, is meant that many people are just moving away from politics itself.
Mentioned migration as a key point. There did seem to be, and I'm not sure if it's still the case, a racial overtone to this. And in fact, a couple of years ago, he was quite bold in the way that he spoke about it. How much does race play in this?
It allows him to create this outer, as is the case with all forms of xenophobia. You then blame the economic conditions on migrants, on migrants, from Africa, and that has continued. Racism in Tunisia, it was relatively, I mean, wasn't not there, was there, but at least a lot more covert. Under Said, it's increased exponentially. Um, and also, as I said, as you said, as he's tried to look at the worsening economic conditions, worsening levels of crime, he's blamed it on African migration, even though there's no real evidence at all. Um, so it's a two-stick approach, or two-pronged approach. He's basically blaming the problems on migration and then negotiating with the EU, to receive funds to actually stop the migration in Tunisia and not allow them to go through. So it's that situation that he faces now. The bigger problem with migration, and specifically the race issue in migration, is that Said, doesn't feel constrained enough by units and organizations, the African Union, and is rather more concerned about the Arab League, the EU, and so any proclamations against racism uh, is shunned, and it's allowing him to try and find excuses for the lackluster economic performance over the past few years. But I mean, I think as inflation increases, as the unemployment rate, the population are not necessarily going to tolerate that so easily. Whether or not they're, it's going to force him to change his stance is a different story.
Why do you think he's been allowed to get away with this, both inside the country and beyond?
So inside the country, I think people are just distrustful of politicians, and people are more concerned with their own livelihoods, and so there's that move away. There's that a disillusionment with politics itself, and so that's a big factor domestically, because from a political perspective, at least at an elite contestation level, he's opposed by everyone. Um, but I mean, we saw in the turnout, very little people trust Tunisian politics.
How do
Regionally, though,
Ibrahim, let me just jump in again. I'm talking about these dictatorial tendencies because I keep seeing El Ben Ali in this scenario, and I just wonder, a country that has come out of that era, celebrated the coming out of that era, are seeing it replayed. Why are they allowing this to happen? Or Is he getting the support of the army or other powerful forces?
I think the support. Okay, so initially he came into power democratically, and that was the one key factor, at least for the first 5 years, for the first 3 years. And slowly but surely, they've he's pushed back those checks on his power, and he's done it in a very careful, coordinated measure because he's a former constitutional law professor. He's done it very slowly. And yes, the situation now is like, in the first few years, last few years of Ben Ali. The difference, though, is Ben Ali was in charge for 26 years and Said now for 6. That's one of the key differences domestically. But at a institutional level, obviously, he's now captured the judiciary. He's now captured the parliament. He's captured the regions. And that allows him, at least from a political institutional perspective, to rule as if he were a democracy. Meanwhile, it's actually a dictatorship, similar to Ben Ali. He doesn't necessarily yet have the interior minister and the security apparatus. They seem to be quite neutral, but supporting him. His support, though, comes from regionally. Many in the region, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, are very pleased with him because they see participatory political Islam such as Nahda as the greatest threat to them. Egypt, the Islamic, the Muslim Brotherhood, similarly in the UAE, and so they have been helping him with both funding but also intelligence coordination. Apparently, Egyptian officials were there when he, froze Parliament in 2021. Two is the migration issue. So there's the migration issue and the racism within Tunisia, but there's also the migration issue to Italy, via Tunisia, Libya, USA, and then into Italy. That is actually lessened. And it's lessened because the EU has basically funded him uh, uh, billions of dollars over the past few years to actually crack down on that immigrant and migration route there at the Tunisia level. And because of its successes, I mean, everyone has said that this election procedurally is flawed. It's not. It wasn't a free election in a sense at all. But I mean, there's been no pushback from any EU country from against its funds, against its finances being used in this process, and that's because he serves a purpose for them, and that's where that legitimacy comes from. It's a regional, global legitimacy rather than a democratic internal legitimacy. And I mean that doesn't seem like it's going to change in the near future, especially as we see, the rest of the region in chaos.
So, what is life like for Tunisians? And is it because of mismanagement, misrule, or are there other issues at play that he's been able to explain away?
I mean, I think there's the political aspects, the xenophobic aspects, the distrust aspects that 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 he's used as excuses. But and also in saying so, there does need to be a restructuring of the way Tunisian institutions work. Previously it was uh, bias and prejudice towards, or in a sense, towards the coastal areas where tourism was significant. And the hinterlands were seen as the areas that weren't focused on. Tunisia's population is about 8 to 10 million, not very big population, not also very big territory. But the coastline was seen as significant. Tourism was at the coast, and many in the hinterlands did not see real development, and did not see any benefit for that first 9 8 9 years after the uprising. Didn't help that COVID was part of those 9 years before the coup. um, and so the average Tunisian, if you're living in the hinterland, inflation is increasing, economic growth is stagnant, um, hasn't improved much after COVID, unemployment is increasing. At on the coast, you're still seeing, I mean, tourism has expanded over the past few years, so that is growing a bit. But that restructuring would have been necessary for for more for the democracy and popular participation to benefit people. And once it stopped benefiting people, and they didn't really trust the politicians, and the belief was that people are in it for their own interests. That's when they started supporting, or that's when they supported Said, and that's when they initially supported his constitutional coup in 2021. The situation is it has worsened, but he's now been able to capture many of the institutions, your media, your judiciary. The army is still. I mean, the interior ministry specifically in Tunisia is still answerable to him. So unless there's discontent within one of those sectors, it's very unlikely to see any change happening, because Tunisians are now more concerned with just daily living.
Let's assume that it becomes unsustainable and that, much like the Arab Spring, that there comes an inflection point and things start to get out of hand. Are neighboring states watching with concern? Because could there be an Arab Spring part two? Or has the dynamics changed so much that it doesn't matter what happens in Tunisia?
I mean, I think Tunisia was lucky initially because no one expected it. The Arab states have, the neighboring states have gotten much more uh, uh, aware since then. And that's why they've actively worked to redress what has happened, to basically reverse what has happened. So they supported the coup in Egypt, for example, in 2013. They supported, partially have now Syria has re-entered the Arab League. We've seen the reversals in Yemen, and so most of them were fearful that that would slowly but surely come to their regimes. And so what they took the two-pronged approach. One was up public service spending and crackdowns domestically. So we saw that in Saudi Arabia, we saw that in the UAE, we saw that in Bahrain, and then also fund counter-revolutionary forces in other countries. We saw it in Egypt, we saw it in Yemen, Syria, and also now Tunisia over the past couple of years. And so it's very unlikely that that neighboring countries would actually allow another uprising or threat to Ben Ali, as long as he's seen as benefiting their interests. And if you look at Ben Ali's positions from a foreign policy perspective, he's been very supportive of the Gulf, knowing where his funding is coming from. And that's been key in allowing him the space and providing him the support to actually continue the uprising. And similarly, at the international level, because of the chaos in the region, we saw an election in Algeria less than a month ago, where the turnout at, I mean, just over 30%, just around the same turnout, and the president winning with 95% of the vote. We all know that process was flawed as well, but stability is what's seen as key for the globe, and support and patronage is seen as what's key for the region. And that's, Tunisia at the moment still seems to be in that, in that milieu, and it's not because it's not threatening. It will be allowed to, or say it will be allowed to consolidate his control even further.
So, does that mean that democracy in Tunisia is dying a natural death? What now for opposition parties and opposing political voices?
I think the big issue for opposition parties is to actually keep united until 2029. At the moment, that's the one difference between Tunisia and Egypt, for example. Egypt, there was big political polarization. Tunisia, there isn't really big political polarization, at least on a democracy versus dictatorship versus military level. There's ideological differences, even worse in Egypt, Tunisia than Egypt, but they all do still seem to be aligned to the political process or democratic process. And so it's about keeping that unity, keeping that coalescing to actually ensure that, if say it tries to stay on in 2029, that there's a bigger movement to oust him. Until then, I think that because of the situation regionally and globally, it's very unlikely that international companies and countries are going to pull out support. And until that happens, Said will be, in power unless there's a very significant change, in the domestic situation, which doesn't seem so. It's just getting worse slowly.
As with many countries, what can often happen is that the politics of the day become politics of a personality. If Kais Saied disappears for whatever reason, is there a complete reset, or is his movement, whatever that might be, continue?
It seems to be very based on the individual. Um, when we look at Tunisian politics, we don't really see any deputy who we think, say, trusts, or we've seen prime ministers move over the past couple of years. So there isn't anyone that you can say would be a successor that would continue in his vein. Now, obviously, there would be forces benefiting from him who would want to try and hold on to power if he happens to disappear. But it does seem that he is the center that glues the glue that's keeping this dictatorship together. And if he somehow is, he's still very young, but falls sick, or there probably is then that space um, for but more restructuring, because obviously the political parties are still there. They still do exist. Nahda, Dahya, Kalb, all of them are still there. Um, but as I said, the person in power is currently wielding all the instruments, and I think it's he alone that's wielding most of these instruments. So yeah, I mean there is that possibility, but Said does seem to still be very healthy, and because there is doesn't seem to be internal dissent. He does seem to be quite consolidated in his control.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on this podcast. Ibrahim Dean, your insights and analysis, greatly appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
That was Ibrahim Dean talking to us about political developments in Tunisia. President Said has been re-elected, 90% of the vote. Only 27% of the people showed up. But what we know is that it's with an iron hand he's ruling the country. We'll keep on watching that space for you. And that's how we come to the end of this week's podcast. Before we go, please don't forget to share your thoughts with us on our social media platforms, and you can see those on the screen now. We'd love to hear from you. Comment on this program, and perhaps give us suggestions for future conversations that we should be having. So until the next time, from all of us, have a great week ahead.
You are watching Channel Africa Conversation.